So, hi there and welcome to our fourth lecture on the Odyssey. This time we are going to be looking at books 9 to 10 and focusing especially on the colonist's mindset. So we'll jump straight in. Greek colonization in the 8th century BC. So it was a process of Greek expansion that took place between 734 and 580 BC, and it was mostly driven by several independent city-states or poleis. So the main colonizing cities were Chalkis, Eretria, Corinth, Megara, Miletus and Phocaea. And Chalkis and Eretria were very much the pioneers in this settlement movement. So Eretrian Corsica was the first colony in the Adriatic Sea, and Cumae on the Bay of Naples, which was primarily of Chalcidian foundation, was the first Greek colony on the mainland of southern Italy. The Chalcidians also founded Naxos on Sicily. So Agrigento was the last of the major Greek colonies on Sicily, founded around 580 BC. And that's a photo I took in April. Very nice time to visit Sicily in April. Not too hot, not too many crowds. And Agrigento was fantastic. The Valia temples. So, both the terms Greek and colonization must be applied with caution to avoid projecting modern interpretations onto an ancient phenomenon. This is a literature course, not a history course. We're not going to get too bogged down in technicalities, but it is worth noting that Greek colonization is a study area open to numerous interpretations, not least because of biases and agendas of both ancient and modern historians. Above all, we should bear in mind that this expansion was mostly driven by city-states acting independently. And while some aspects of Greek colonization are comparable to the colonizing of European imperial powers, much is distinctive. More on that shortly. Reasons for settlement range from overpopulation to land hunger, resource exploitation, influence extension, and more. So the various motivations behind settlement are one of the largest differences when compared with European colonization. Much of the Peloponnese is all but infertile, and it is possible that such lands could no longer support growing populations, and that's why they had to look elsewhere. In fact, it's worth mentioning first that some colonies were even founded to escape civil unrest. For instance, Taras was founded by the Parthenians, who were descendants of Spartan women, but they were denied citizenship rights. Now, this process of colonization usually involved a mother city, metropolis, establishing a daughter colony, apoikia, which had its own system of governance. So, for the colonizing mission, they sent an oikistes, a leader, who was nominated by the colonists. The colony was decided in advance, and business advantages plus protection from raiders were offered as settlement incentives. The colonists then parcelled out the land, including farms, and unlike under European colonialism, the new settlement soon became independent of its metropolis. So, got a good quote here from reading the Odyssey, A Guide to Homer's Narrative, written actually by Jonas Kretlein. He is a professor of classical philology here in Heidelberg, where I did my master's. So, to use the term colonization for this expansion is problematic. since it invites false associations. Unlike the colonisation, whereby early modern states seized the New World, the settlement of the Mediterranean was not centrally controlled. The oracle at Delphi seems to have been a hub where information was gathered, but settlements emanated from a multitude of Greek polis. It is even in doubt whether the foundations had any official character. At least in some cases, it is more likely that they were private initiatives. Often, cities may well not have emerged through a single founding act, but developed from trading posts that were initially intended to be temporary. Whereas in the early modern period, gaining and developing land were important goals of colonisation, the settlements of the Greeks were limited to coastal regions and did not involve demanding tribute or laying claim to the hinterland. And unlike the Spanish and English empires, the new settlements quickly became independent of the mother states. And here is a nice map to show that Greek expansion. So the squares are the parent cities. So we have, for instance, Megara, Chalkis, Sparta, and then further east, so what is modern day Turkey, Phocaea, Miletus, names I mentioned before. And yeah, the red areas were settled. And if you keep that image in mind, especially the red areas, and now have a look at this map, the journey of Odysseus, you will see that there's a lot of similarities. Yeah, so particularly around Asia Minor and around Sicily. So having a look back there, you go Sicily and southern Italy in general, and then all around the Mediterranean, around the Greek Mediterranean. So that gives you a good idea of the historic influence on Odysseus' seafaring adventures. Now, talk a bit here about the threefold structure of Odysseus' travels. So, his travels in books 9 to 12, and I've color coded them here so you can get an idea. So in book 9, we start with Cecones and the Lotus Eaters, and then we have the main adventure, which is with the Cyclopes. Book 10 is the same. We have 2 mini adventures, first with Aeolus, then with the Laestrygonians, and then with Circe. Book 11 breaks this pattern, but book 12 resumes it. We have first adventure of the Sirens, the second mini adventure Scylla and Charybdis, and then the island of Helios, Thrinace. And it is worth mentioning that books 9 to 12, which are all narrated by Odysseus, are by far the most fantastical of the entire epic. And this threefold structure is important. We're going to talk about why it's important in a couple of lectures time, and then especially during the seminars as well. So moving on to book 9, Odysseus as colonizer. So his first journey is with the first adventure, is with the Cecones. They live in a city called Ismarus and are simply a foreign folk. We get a first view into the mind of Odysseus as a colonizer. So he says, "The same wind that wafted me from Ilium brought me to Ismarus, the city of the Cecones. I sacked this place and destroyed its menfolk. The women and the vast plunder that we took from the town we divided so that no one, as far as I could help it, should go short of his proper share." However, Odysseus' crew get distracted by all the food and wine and refuse to leave, resulting in the Cecones gathering their forces and killing 6 of Odysseus' men. It is always 6 of Odysseus' men who die. Again, that is important, as we'll talk about in a couple of lectures' time. Also notable, Odysseus being held back by his foolish comrades, by his foolish crew members, or at least so he claims, is a pattern that emerges in books 9 to 12. So after 9 days at sea, Odysseus and his crew reach the land of the Lotus Eaters. This is the second mini-adventure in book 9. So the Lotus Eaters are a race that eat the flowery lotus fruit. We disembarked to draw water, and my crews quickly had a meal by the ships. When we had eaten and drunk, I sent some of my followers inland to find out what sort of human beings might be there, detailing 2 men for the duty with a third as herald. So, in this second quote here, the part in purple is key. Odysseus wants to know if the locals are friendly or hostile, just as you would if you are a settler arriving at a new land. The Greek is even more revealing because Odysseus doesn't really say what sort of humans might be there. He says Ceton edontes, which literally means eaters of grain, and Richard Lattimore, in his translation of the Odyssey, writes eaters of bread. Making bread is a process that involves a degree of civilization. It's basically saying, I want to know whether civilized people live there or savages. Okay, and this is going to be a topic we'll see again and again in this lecture. Unfortunately for Odysseus and his crew, the Lotophages, the lotus eaters, merely eat a mythical fruit that makes Odysseus' men not care for anything, not even their nostos, their return home, and so Odysseus is forced to drag them back to the ships. And here we have a nice 17th century French engraving of Odysseus on the island of the Lotus Eaters. Okay. So, the next place Odysseus comes to is the land of the Cyclopes, whom he depicts as the antithesis of a civilized Greek polis. The Cyclopes have no assemblies for the making of laws, nor any established legal codes, but live in hollow caverns in the mountain heights, where each man is lawgiver to his own children and women, and nobody has the slightest interest in what his neighbours decide. And now we're going to get the specific viewpoint of an 8th century BC potential settler. As Odysseus says, the Cyclopes have nothing like our ships with their crimson prows. They have no shipwrights to build merchantmen that could give them the means of sailing across the sea to visit foreign towns and people, as other nations do. Such craftsmen would have turned the island into a fine colony for the Cyclopes. So Odysseus emphasizes to the seafaring Phaeacians, whom he's telling his story, that the Cyclopes lands represent a loss of potential. They would make a fine colony, but the inhabitants are too savage to know how to make use of these blessings. And nice terracotta figurine there of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, whom Odysseus is about to encounter. So Odysseus is telling the Phaeacians it's a land of savages, etc. But with a twist of his typical masterful ambiguity, Homer also permits a completely different reading. So Odysseus mentions that he and his crew came to the land of the Cyclopes, a fierce, lawless people who never lift a hand to plant or plough, but just leave everything to the immortal gods. All the crops they require spring up unsown and untilled, wheat and barley and vines with generous clusters that swell with the rain from heaven to yield wine. It is by no means a poor country, but capable of yielding any crop in due season. Along the shore of the grey sea, There are lush water meadows where the grapes would never fail. So this actually shows that the Cyclopes lived in an idyllic, self-sustaining country and thus have no need of travelling overseas or settling quarrels through law. In fact, it reminds us very much of Sherry, the first utopia in world literature, where the Phaeacians live. So here's that quote again. Their fruit never fails nor runs short, winter and summer alike. It comes at all seasons of the year, and there is never a time when the west wind's breath is not assisting, so that pear after pear, apple after apple, cluster on cluster of grapes, and fig upon fig are always coming to perfection. So that is in Homer's narrative, so to say, rather than Odysseus. But that's the land of the Phaeacians, this wonderful utopia where Odysseus could marry Nausicaa and settle there and never go home. And both the land of the Cyclopes and Sherry are reminiscent of the Golden Age as described by Hesiod. So we talked briefly about this in the last lecture, but worth showing again here. So here's a quote from Hesiod's Work and Days. For the fruitful earth unforced bore them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things, rich in flocks and loved by the blessed gods. So the Cyclopes leave everything to the gods. That suggests that they are loved by the gods because the gods wouldn't help them otherwise. And like on Sherry, like in the Golden Age, they don't need to do any farming, and they don't have any war. It really is a utopia. So Homer is showing there is another narrative here. There's another way of understanding what Odysseus is describing. And in fact, you could say Odysseus is doing what many European powers did, interpret different lifestyles as savagery. Fortunately, Homer is a competent enough poet to show that this is a utopia despite Odysseus' insults and deprecations. In fact, these descriptions remind me very much of pre-Hispanic Colombia. So the abundance of fruit and other foods in pre-Hispanic Colombia, because of course it has incredibly rich soil with the Amazon, etc. This abundance resulted in very few conflicts. For example, they did not need as much, they didn't have to fight over lands for grazing, and they didn't need the same depth of legislation as they did in European countries at the time, because they weren't getting into as many conflicts and battles, basically. In fact, there was one conquistador who said about one Colombian civilization that the soil was so productive that they simply dedicated 1 month to agriculture and then the next to parties and orgies. So yeah, funny comparison I found there. Okay, moving on to the main action of Book 9. This is another topic, another important motif throughout the epic, brain versus brawn. In Book 9, this is personified through Odysseus and Polyphemus, respectively. So, Polyphemus lives aloof in his own lawless way and is quite unlike any man who eats bread. There you go again. Eating bread as a sign of civilization. So this is Odysseus emphasizing that Polyphemus is savage, brutal, colossal. He does this repeatedly throughout Book 9. He wishes to show that Polyphemus is deserving of his fate. On a thematic level, though, as I said, this is Homer showing that brain triumphs over brawn. Strength is no match for wits, and Odysseus is the master of stratagems. In fact, Odysseus outwitting Polyphemus and stabbing out his eye will become his best known victory and source of Kleos after the wooden horse. Ovid takes up this motif of brain versus brawn in the judgment of arms between Odysseus and Ajax. We'll have a look at that in the seminars. So Polyphemus says, "We Cyclopes care nothing for Zeus with his Aegis." This shows to the Phaeacians and Homer's audience that Polyphemus truly is a savage. There was a Greek virtue of being God-fearing. It's like one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if that term, God, fear of God, gift of the Holy Spirit, comes from this Greek virtue of being God-fearing. And worth mentioning again, European colonial missionaries, they often denigrated local belief systems to justify their cruel treatment of indigenous populations. So Odysseus, again, he's showing the Cyclopes don't worship our gods, they have no gods. Polyphemus got what was coming to him. It is notable, though, that later in the book, one of the Cyclopes actually references Zeus. So either Polyphemus here is alone, he doesn't respect the gods, or he is simply lying. So he says this after Odysseus has asked for Xenia for guest friendship. And on that topic, Polyphemus killing and eating Odysseus' men is an abominable, gross violation of Xenia. He doesn't respect the god of suppliance, hence no guest gifts for Odysseus and no respect for Xenia. So we come to now one of the best known and cleverest word plays in the history of world literature. Odysseus tells Polyphemus his name is Utis, no one. But in a Greek conditional clause, this changes to metis, a clever wordplay on metis with the long e, which means cunning intelligence. So essentially, Odysseus says it was metis that had won me this little struggle. So it's no one himself, but also his cunning intelligence. It's very, very intelligent, very smart, excellent poetry. So Odysseus, as an epic hero, wishes to accumulate kleos, which involves people telling praiseworthy stories of him after his death. He therefore says, as they are sailing away from the island where Polyphemus is now blind, "Cyclops, if anyone ever asks you how you came by your blindness, tell him your eye was put out by Odysseus, sacker of cities, the son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca." So he goes back on his story of being called no one because he wants this story to get told again and again. Unfortunately, it backfires for him because Polyphemus can now invoke his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus so that he only reaches home after many tribulations and having lost all his men. This introduces another important thematic dynamic present in books 9 to 12, Odysseus longing for kleos and the trouble this gets him and his crew into. And here is an excellent amphora painting of Odysseus putting out Polyphemus' eye. Okay, we come to book 10 now, and like books 9 and 12, it begins with 2 mini episodes as mentioned. The first is with Aeolus, whom Zeus has made Lord of the Winds. So this episode gives Odysseus another chance to underscore the folly of his crew, since they open the bag with the winds and get blown back to Aeolus Island. Aeolus then sends Odysseus away in disgust, saying he is clearly loathed by the gods. And perhaps what is most famous about this episode is that Aeolus has 6 daughters whom he has given to his 6 sons in marriage. Now, there is a lot of incest in Greek mythology. Zeus and Hera are brother and sister, for instance, but incest was not a common practice in ancient Greece. So this would have signalled again that Aeolus has strange customs, that he is foreign. So 7 days later, Odysseus and his crew arrive at the land of the Laurentians. Odysseus once again sends ahead men to see if there are any eaters of grain there, Siton Edontes. And here we have a very nice contrast to Odysseus' arrival on Sherry, the island of the Phaeacians. So I read out the quote. Presently they came across a strong girl drawing water outside the town, the daughter of Antiphates, the Laurentian chief. She had come down to a bubbling spring called Odyssey, from which the townspeople drew their water. So we have a juxtaposition here, or a contrast rather, whereas Nausicaa brings Odysseus to her father's palace when he encounters her going to fetch water and wash clothes, and Odysseus is then able to supplicate Nausicaa's mother, Arete. This time, Odysseus is taken to the palace and confronted by a woman of mountainous proportions, and the royal couple try to eat him. So, giant Laurentians are cannibals and capture some of Odysseus' men, carrying them off like fishes on a spear to make their loathsome meal. So Odysseus is forced to flee, though not all his crew escape. It really is remarkable just how many cannibals Odysseus encounters, who knew there were so many in the Mediterranean. What is interesting though, Herodotus says about the Thracians, who were famously ferocious, that they made their quivers out of human skin. And for a long time, historians regarded this simply as a legend, as a myth. But not long ago, they actually tested a piece of a Thracian quiver, tested the DNA, and found out that some of it did contain human skin. So clearly Herodotus there was actually onto something. Now, in Greek tradition, the Laurentians are located on Sicily, but the Romans placed them at Formiae in Campania on the mainland. And here we've got a modern version of a mural in the Vatican Museum. So the original was painted around 60 to 40 BC. So there they are, destroying Odysseus' ships. Okay, we come to now one of the most famous characters of the Odyssey and many people's favourite character, Circe, who is the archetypal Enchantress. So she's a powerful witch with an exquisite voice and perhaps world literature's first femme fatale. There's going to be a lot of them in the Odyssey. Well, maybe Clytemnestra is the first one. But anyway, Circe is one of the first for sure. And yes, she lives on the island of Aea, A-E-A-E-A, an island whose name is famously composed purely of vowels. Circe is daughter of Helios and Perse, so Helios the sun god, and Perse, who is one of the 3,000 freshwater nymphs known as the Oceanids. Circe is a sorceress known for her use of drugs. She turns Odysseus' men into swine, and it is only through Hermes' help with the plant Moly that Odysseus does not suffer the same fate. And this is what Odysseus tells the Phaeacians about Circe. Prowling about the place were mountain wolves and lions that Circe had bewitched with her magic drugs. They did not attack my men, but rose on their hind legs to fawn on them. They could hear Circe within, singing in her beautiful voice as she went to and fro at her great and everlasting loom, on which she was weaving one of those delicate, graceful, and dazzling fabrics that goddesses make. So, like Medea, Circe is a foreign enchantress and another temptation for Odysseus, another person who might prevent him from reaching home, just like the sex goddess Calypso. So, made the parallel with Medea, Circe actually knows Medea. So, when when Medea has betrayed her country, Colchis, by helping Jason get the Golden Fleece, and then they are fleeing on ship, she and Jason cut up her brother and dump his body parts in the sea, forcing her father to slow them down because he needs to pick up the body pieces so that he can give his son a proper burial. They come to Circe, and Circe then purifies Medea and Jason, purging Medea of fratricide. Also worth a brief reflection on the various women we've encountered. We've got the likes of Calypso and Circe, who are sexual temptations, beautiful young demigoddesses. They might stop Odysseus getting home because he wants to ling with them. Nausicaa is not a goddess, but described like one, and you could put her in the same category. For another category, we've got Clytemnestra and the Laurentian queen, who are the monstrous women. Clytemnestra, of course, with the help of her lover Aegisthus, killed Agamemnon on his return home, and the Laurentian queen tried to eat Odysseus. So there we've got dangerous women in a different sort of way. And then you've got the absolute contrast to them, Penelope, of course, the very virtuous wife of Odysseus, patiently waiting for him, and Arete, whose name means virtue, and Odysseus supplicates her on sherry, and he ends up being treated very well by them and will get sent home to Ithaca on one of their ships. So, I've mentioned, I think, before that John William Waterhouse is one of my favourite painters, and this is one of my favourite paintings. Circe offering the cup to Ulysses. This is the cup where if he drinks it, he'll turn into a pig. But fortunately, he has the help of Hermes. And in fact, if you look at the picture down to the right, for instance, you can see one of those pigs. Yeah, so that's one of Odysseus' men, presumably. And in the mirror, you see Odysseus coming over. So Odysseus stays with Circe for a whole year. First, he makes Circe swear to turn his crew back into men, and then, of course, he goes to bed with her. And in Greek mythology, he has a son by her whom she calls Telegonus. And in the epic poem, the Telegony, which is part of the epic cycle, these epics which told the story of the Trojan War and the Trojan heroes returns home, Telegonus gets caught in a squall and is blown onto Ithaca without him realising where he is. He then steals the cattle there, but Odysseus comes out to defend his livestock, and Telegonus ends up killing Odysseus, only realising in his father's death throes that he has just committed patricide. So the Telegonus is fragmentary, but we have a good idea of what happened, and after the patricide, things get really weird. Telegonus brings Odysseus' corpse, as well as Penelope and Telemachus, to Aea, where Circe makes them immortal. Then Circe marries Telemachus, and Telegonus marries Penelope. That means Odysseus is buried on Aea and not on Ithaca. So, good, strange stories in Greek mythology. So, John William Waterhouse loved Circe as much as I love his paintings. He also did this one in 1891, Circe Invidiosa, so jealous Circe. This is based on the story, well, the best known version is by Ovid in his Metamorphoses. It is the love triangle Circe, Scylla and Glaucus. So Glaucus spurned Circe because he hoped to attain Scylla's love. Scylla was a beautiful mortal girl. But Scylla is repulsed by the sea god's piscine form and thus flees. Circe is jealous of Scylla and consequently poisons a pool she likes to bathe in, turning Scylla into the monster Odysseus will encounter in Book 12. And there's a nice painting I'll show you in the next lecture of Glaucus and Scylla. And over 20 years later, John William Waterhouse returned to the topic of Circe in this painting, The Sorceress. So he really was fascinated by her. And just to end, here we have Samantha Morton. She is playing Circe in Christopher Nolan's film adaptation, which I'm going to see later this week. So looking forward to that. A little bit terrified that he might ruin one of my favourite pieces of world literature, but we'll see what he does. He's normally not too bad. And also we have this best-selling novel by Madeline Miller, Circe. So this was her second novel. Her first one is called The Song of Achilles, and it's told from the viewpoint of Patroclus, Achilles' lover. So Madeline Miller claims to have invented a new genre which she calls mythological realism. I think there's some justification in her claim. Essentially, it's the topics of realism, so love, human relationships, ambition, difficulties in human life, etc. But it all takes place within the world of Greek mythology. So the gods do exist, they do intervene in human lives, the Minotaur does exist, things like that. And yes, her second novel, Circe, is very good. I enjoyed it a lot. I preferred The Song of Achilles. She spent 10 years writing The Song of Achilles, and you can just tell she spent 10 years penning it, whereas after the success of that, of course, the publishers wanted her to get out a book really quickly, and so Circe came out a bit more quickly, and it's good, but not quite the same level. There's also a few technical qualms I and my class at the university had with it, but on the whole, a very good novel, and I can recommend. All right, that's it for today. The next lecture is going to be on books 11 and 12, so we'll be looking at Odysseus' journey into the underworld, and also the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, and the death of Odysseus' crew. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.